intelligencesquared.com.
All right, I think I'm going to, in turn, thank Ashley for setting up my argument, because he's spoken about what international system the British has set up. And actually, my argument is not just that Britain's former colonies should stop blaming empire for their ills, that in fact they have, or they're beginning to anyway. And let's look really at what are the issues here. First of the things to think about is this international system. When did it start? Well, it started before the empire that we are talking about, presumably. Because if we think Britain really had two empires, the first empire was the Atlantic-based empire of the 17th and 18th centuries, and the greatest of the former colonies of that was the USA. Now, is the USA, the former colony of Britain, blaming empire for its ills? Certainly not. Most people would say that the USA is in fact running Britain. And if we think of some of the other prominent former colonies of that first empire, notably Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, they're not blaming empire for their ills. They, in fact, have claimed allegiance to the crown through the Commonwealth over time. And if we think about the indigenous populations there that are potentially less grateful, a lot of them have been eradicated, so they're not complaining at all. And those that are alive and have some problems with what's happened to them in their past don't seem to be blaming Britain. They're blaming the former white settlers, or the new generation of the former white settlers in the area that are the rulers there. So I'm presuming we're not talking about these particular former colonies. So let's think about the second large empire, the late 19th century, the late Victorian Empire, which we can say, okay, well, the colonies of conquest, they span a very large area, and actually the great variety between these different colonies. I mean, if we think about 40 different categories of overseas territories run by 3 different offices in Britain, the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office, the India Office, how do we even begin to start generalizing across this? Well, let's try doing it in terms of thinking first of what we're talking about when we speak about ills. If we think about past ills versus current ills, I'm going to show you how actually the different colonies aren't really blaming Britain anymore. They've got new enemies, and it's tied to the global capitalist system that Britain was more or less an apostle for. But it wasn't empire alone that integrated these areas into the global capitalist system. This was happening long before Britain entered as a ruler, and has been continuing afterwards. So if we think firstly, okay, what sort of past ills could we be talking about? Well, on the poster for this debate, there was a gentleman holding up the sign, Britain should repay or give payment for the Kenyan gulag, something to that effect. I think those sorts of issues, yes, people should be able to blame Britain for those sorts of issues, but the sorts of people who would be able to hold Britain accountable for these sorts of issues are dying off. I mean, it has been about 60 years since Kenya decolonized, so surely, you know, I think that these sorts of claims are beginning to subside. But if we think about the current ills, let's think about the things that Ashley, for example, has mentioned. He talks about social ethnic tensions, and that certainly we could say these might have been drawn by Britain through their demarcation of territorial boundaries. But if we want to take an example of how this might have worked out, what sorts of social tensions, we can think, okay, well, social tensions were probably exacerbated via political institutions. And we think about the different sorts of groups that were allowed representation on colonial political bodies and institutions. So let's say the Legislative Council, because a lot of authors like Hamza Levy talk about how the British Empire institutions were, I think it was, a kind of administrative without a legislative focus, so not very representational. I can't remember the exact phrase, so we'll move on here. But the point is that on the legislative councils, you had representation of groups. So if we look at a place like India, it was religious representation. If we look at a place like Nigeria, it was often allocated on ethno-regional lines. If we go to a place like Kenya, we'd see that legislative representation was done on a racial basis. So you had Europeans having legislative representation, and then you had Asian groups, Asiatics as they called them in their day. And then finally, very late in the period, you had Africans who were allowed legislative representation. But upon decolonization, these racial divisions disappeared, and they were replaced by ethnic divisions somehow. Or actually, if we think of the Kenyan African National Union, it was supposed to be putting together some of the major groups. So it started out representing the Kikuyu and the Luo. And it was only later on that KANU, as it's known for short, started to represent mainly the Kikuyu and starting to disassociate itself from the Luo. And that might explain some of the tensions you saw in the 2007 elections, that the tensions between the two groups. So really, this wasn't something that Britain did necessarily. This was something that took place afterwards. If we think about the political practices, we could say, okay, well, Britain didn't give any sort of political training to its former colonies in the main. India, at least the Hindus and Muslims in India, had representation on the Legislative Council after 1909, but if we look at a place like Tanzania, Tanganyika as it was called at the time, it was only 3 years before independence in 1958 that the first Africans were allowed to be elected to the Legislative Council. So we could think, okay, this might be an issue in terms of being able to run a system that was cohesive, probably would degrade into some form of autocracy that was going to be crushing to the people, yet we look at someone like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. Even though he ran a single-party system, an autocratic system, which he referred to as a single-party democracy, he actually enjoyed greater legitimacy, and that party enjoyed greater legitimacy than most other parties that are democratic anywhere else. But what we really want to think about is the economic consequences of empire. And here I'll say that, yes, the British didn't allocate a lot to social welfare or any sorts of programs that would benefit people until after World War II, but what they did engage in was railways and ports and military. This accounted for 60% of spending in all the colonies that I've looked at over time. And if we say, okay, well, this is extending the capitalist system, well, okay, we can say that, but would these countries and the regions of the countries that were more modern or less modern have remained that way had the British not been there? Yes, perhaps, because on the coast they were more modern and developed, and on the interior of a lot of the countries they were less developed. But even in these places, they're not blaming Britain anymore, they're blaming the US. How do we know this? Because Britain's former colonies in the Middle East blame America, and we can see this through terrorism and violence there. And if we think about the economic structures where there was resistance to Britain just after empire in terms of self-reliance as the economic model, we've seen now people moving more towards international integration in trade. This, of course, has been put in place by structural adjustment policies by the IMF and the World Bank, but again, these structures are dominated by the US, not Britain. So I would say that the former colonies aren't stupid, and they do know that it's the global capitalist system and inequalities amongst different people within countries and within the international system that is the cause of their ills, and not Britain at all. Thank you.